This week on the Lectures in History podcast, George Mason University Religious Studies Department Chair John Turner examines the history of Islam and Judaism in America. Professor Turner came to George Mason after earning a PhD in American history from the University of Notre Dame and a Master's of Divinity from Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. His teachings and scholarship center on the history of religion in the United States, especially Mormonism, evangelicalism, and 17th century Puritanism. A note to our listeners: since the academic year is completed, C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast will not have new episodes until September. Throughout the summer, we will post some of our most interesting lectures and other history-related episodes.
So, my starting question for today is, what counts as an American religion? It would probably be most logical to answer that question by examining the cultures and cosmology of maybe the Wampanoag, the Lakota, or the Comanche. Or, I suppose, you could read the Book of Mormon, which narrates the story of pre-Christian Christian Jews who come to the New World and eventually establish what they call the Church of Christ.
Well, that's the thing. He believes that those people were Native Americans.
Well, but we're not going to do that. What we're going to do instead is start by thinking about the United States of today and then work our way backwards. If you think about American religion, about 2/3 of Americans self-identify as Christian. That doesn't necessarily mean they go to church or believe in all of the doctrines of Christianity, but if you ask Americans, what's your religion? About 2 out of 3 will say Christian. That number's declined a bit in recent decades, but Christianity remains by far the most dominant religious tradition in the United States. No question about that. And I think most of us, therefore, think of Christianity as an American religion, as a tradition that has really deep roots in this place, which is true. What about Jews or Muslims? If you ask Americans to identify their religion, apparently about 1.5% will say Jewish. There are some additional secular Jews in the United States, which might bump that figure up to maybe 2.5%. But it's a pretty small minority. About 1.5% of Americans self-identify as Muslim. Some semesters I ask my students, what percentage of Americans are Jewish or Muslim? And it's sort of like The Price is Right, except they will massively overestimate the percentages. And I think that's partly because at George Mason University, about 10 or 12% of students are Muslim. Our area in general has a tremendous amount of religious diversity. But Jews and Muslims are pretty tiny slivers of the American population. And perhaps because of that, many Americans, especially if they are Christians, regard Judaism to some degree, and Islam in particular, as recent, maybe foreign imports. And one problem with that idea is that it's not true. The Muslim population of the United States has grown rapidly since 1965, but Islam has deep roots in North America. And the history of Jews in what became the United States is nearly as old. So I have some examples for you. The first likely Muslim to have stepped foot on what later became American territory was a Moroccan man enslaved by the Spanish who was part of an expedition, a really ill-fated expedition that started in Florida in the year 1528. His name was Estevanico, or sometimes it's simply recorded as Estevan. Might not be his original name. Estevanico had at some point in his life been baptized as a Christian, but he spoke Arabic, and it's likely that his conversion was forced by his Spanish captors. The expedition, by the way, didn't go very well. The Spanish were trying to explore Florida and then head west. Most people on the expedition perished pretty quickly. Then the survivors tried to travel by boat around the Gulf of Mexico. They shipwrecked. Only 4 individuals survived, including Estevanico. He actually ended up for a time as a captive of an indigenous group in northern Mexico. So he was sort of doubly enslaved for a portion of his life. What about Jews? There are a couple of early examples. Jews have lived in what became the United States nearly as long as Christians have done so. There were Jews who came to what became New York in the year 1654, when it was New Netherlands and governed by the Dutch. And there was also a Jewish man who was hired as part of another ill-fated expedition in 1585, the Roanoke expedition. A metal worker named Joachim Gans. Gans died like everybody else on that expedition. Jews in New Netherlands were not particularly welcomed by the Dutch who were there, but they successfully contended for their citizenship rights. Most of the Jews who initially came to New Netherlands departed after several years, but there was a man named Asser Levy who stayed in what became New York for the rest of his life. One thing I really like about Asser Levy, just a small detail, is that he once gave a significant amount of his money to help a group of Lutherans in New York build their church. I find that's just a really nice gesture. So these are really long histories that go back 400 or 500 years. And I gave you an example of one known early American Muslim. But for the most part, the early history of Islam in the United States has been hidden and obscured. A certain percentage of Africans brought to North America as slaves were Muslim, like the individual I mentioned, Estevanico. Others were Catholic Christians, by the way. Most probably practiced various forms of West African religious traditions. But most of North Africa was Muslim. And therefore, some people who were enslaved and brought to the Western Hemisphere were Muslim. Scholars debate the percentage. I've seen estimates ranging from 1% to 20%. I think nobody actually knows. But since about 500,000 Africans were enslaved and taken to what became the United States, we could be talking about possibly 50,000 enslaved individuals who were Muslim. It's actually a pretty big number. It's a large influx of African Muslims who were taken to North America involuntarily. There are larger numbers, by the way, who went to other places in the Western Hemisphere, including Brazil and the Caribbean. There are even instances of enslaved Muslims gaining their freedom and going back to Africa and reuniting with their communities and families. There was also a Brazilian Muslim revolt against Portuguese authorities in 1835. So Islam has pretty long, substantial roots and histories in North America. There wasn't such a concentration of enslaved Muslims anywhere in the British colonies of North America, but we know that there are at least thousands of obscured and hidden individual histories of men and women captured, enslaved, and taken to places like the Carolinas. I'm going to share one of those stories later today that historians have reconstructed in some detail. So that was kind of a long introduction. My first goal was to convince you that Judaism and Islam have surprisingly long histories in the United States. Given that the earliest history of American Islam was practiced by enslaved individuals, that should complicate any simple notion of the United States or the colonies as bastions of religious freedom. The United States has had a long reputation for religious diversity and relative tolerance, and you see a lot of that in our area. I think you see a lot of that at our university and in our own classroom. But at the same time, it's often not easy for religious minorities, and even religious people more generally, to feel safe or comfortable expressing their religiosity in public. You might remember a Muslim guest that we had a couple of weeks ago in class who shared that she did not wear hijab in high school because she was one of only 4 or 5 Muslim students in her school, and she wanted to be American, or to be thought of as American and not as the Muslim girl. At many points in human history and in American history, in societies with religious minorities, religion has often been lived out in secret, not in the open. So what I'm going to do today is give you some examples of American Jews and American Muslims who have found both opportunities to be public about their tradition, and at other times have kept at least elements of those traditions secret. And what I want to argue is that both of those things have been dynamics in the history of American religion. Public ability to practice a variety of traditions, but also pressure and coercion to be secret and hidden. So we're going to start with the story of a colonial Jewish family, then talk about the conversion of an enslaved Muslim to Christianity, and then toward the end talk about the fact that some American Jews chose to hide their identities in the mid-20th century. So we're going to cover a lot of historical ground and examine this subject from a number of different angles. So here's our first story. It centers on a family of Portuguese Jews who emigrated to the British colonies of North America in the middle of the 18th century. Some of them went to New York, some of them went to Rhode Island, some of them moved to Massachusetts for a time. It was kind of a large family that emigrated in bits and pieces. The main figure in the story that I'm going to tell is a man named Aaron Lopez. In Portugal, he was known as Duarte or Edward Lopez. the image is from a really tiny portrait of him. So when it's blown up, it's a little bit blurry. There's a much larger and more refined portrait of his second wife and one of his sons. In Portugal, the Lopezes were known as Marranos or conversos, which means that they were Jews whose ancestors had publicly converted to Catholicism. Many Jews under pressure from the Spanish Inquisition or Portuguese Inquisition left Portugal and went elsewhere, but some chose to at least publicly embrace Christianity to be able to stay and avoid persecution. Like many of those families, the Lopezes didn't stop being Jewish despite that public conversion to Christianity. They were, you could say, crypto-Jews who quietly maintained elements of their belief and practice. And they were, over time, the family became wealthy. They were merchants who traded widely around the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And the fact that they were secretly Jewish, it placed their wealth at risk. It's not exactly clear why they began leaving Portugal, but it was probably because of the threat of persecution. At least one member of the family had been condemned by the Inquisition as a Jew, and that meant that the rest of the family was under suspicion. In theory, the penalty for secretly practicing Judaism could be execution, which is a scene that you see depicted in this painting from the late 1400s. That probably wasn't, a super likely outcome in the 1730s, but it was a possibility, and lesser penalties could also have been severe. I would encourage you just to pause and reflect on the fact that this is a family that had been secretly practicing its religious tradition for centuries. It's really remarkable. There were plenty of Jews who converted to Christianity under pressure and eventually assimilated into Spanish or Portuguese society. But some of them persisted in practicing Judaism secretly for many generations, many centuries. It's really a remarkable human story. You can find sort of analogous examples in other parts of the world. There was brutal persecution of Christians in Japan in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Some of those Christian families secretly maintained Christian beliefs and practices for centuries as well. The Lopezes had heard that in the British colonies, they would not have to pretend to be Christians. They could live as Jews. And many family members embraced Jewish names after coming to the colonies. For instance, Duarte, or Edward Lopez, now used the name Aaron. He was also circumcised at the age of 20, a practice that conversos in Portugal or Spain could not risk. Aaron Lopez settled in Rhode Island. And there were a number of ways that we know that he lived out his Jewishness. He didn't keep it secret. He was a successful merchant in Newport, Rhode Island, as the family had been in Portugal. But his Christian neighbors knew that he did not conduct business on the Jewish Sabbath or on significant Jewish holidays. He also traded in specifically Jewish things, ranging from kosher meat to Hanukkah oil. Here's an entry from one of his ledgers. It's probably hard to read, but it refers to a quarter cask of matzah, unleavened bread or cracker used during Passover.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So his neighbors were well aware that he was Jewish. He didn't have to keep it secret. There are records of Christian ministers in Newport commenting on the fact that he was an upstanding citizen. He had their respect as an honorable man, despite being a religious minority. Aaron Lopez traded in a lot of other things. He made a lot of money shipping whale oil. He also traded in chocolate. And as the years passed, he became the single richest man in Newport, Rhode Island. We know that because he paid more taxes than anybody else. You can examine records, and whoever paid the most taxes generally was the wealthiest individual. He owned more than a dozen ships, so his life was fabulously successful. It also had a dark side to it. Lopez also traded in human beings. His ships brought hundreds of enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean and ultimately to the United States. It doesn't seem that he owned any enslaved individuals himself, but he did sometimes hire them. And one minor note, he also had all of his workers, free and enslaved, not work on the Sabbath or on high holidays. We've talked a bit about the history of anti-Semitism earlier this semester. One anti-Semitic trope or allegation is that Jews were the prime movers in the transatlantic slave trade. That's not true. And it gives me a little bit of pause that this story about Aaron Lopez might mislead you. Slave trading wasn't the primary source of the Lopez family's wealth, and the vast majority of slave traders were Christian, not Jewish. But history is always messy and complicated. Many people could simultaneously seek freedom for themselves and at the same time participate in denying it to others. And Aaron Lopez played a role in both of those stories. Aaron Lopez's own freedom actually wasn't complete. If you remember anything about Rhode Island from your earlier years of education, you might have heard that it was a bastion of religious liberty. You know, people like Roger Williams, the fact that Quakers could find refuge in Rhode Island. There were a number of Quakers who were executed in Massachusetts Bay. Rhode Island generally was a pretty good place for religious minorities. But religious freedom had its limits, even there. In 1761, Lopez and another Jewish merchant petitioned Rhode Island's government to be naturalized as citizens. That would give them security that they could stay in the colony and also give them the right to vote or hold office. This is what the Rhode Island Assembly said in response to Lopez's petition. As the said Aaron Lopez hath declared himself to be by religion a Jew, this assembly doth not admit him, nor any other of that religion, to the full freedom of the colony to be chosen into any office, nor allowed to give a vote as a free man. So a very straightforward and blunt rejection. No, you can't have citizenship rights because you're a Jew. And so you can't have the right to vote. You can't hold office. Why? The court argued that the colony's royal charter from about 100 years earlier enshrined the free and quiet enjoyment of the Christian religion. So the Rhode Island government concluded that, at least broadly speaking, Christianity was the established religion of the colony. Well into the 19th century, many colonies and then states deprived Jews, Muslims, and atheists, often naming those three groups in particular, as unfit to be citizens, unfit to vote or to hold office. Lopez probably expected this rejection when he filed his petition. It probably still stung. He was not one to give up easily. He actually went to neighboring Massachusetts, was naturalized as a citizen there. He could have moved to New York, which did allow Jews to vote and hold office. But Lopez instead came back to Newport. He never became a citizen, but he remained there as a prosperous resident. Lopez helped establish Truro Synagogue, one of the earliest congregations of Jews in what became the United States. He lived in Newport until 1782. He actually died really tragically. He was returning with his family to Newport on a journey, stopped to water his horses at a nearby, at a pond. His family got out. He was, I don't know, I guess he was still, I don't know, in the carriage on one of the horses. The horses tumbled into the pond and he drowned, apparently with his family looking on, which must have just been terrible. After his death, Newport remained a significant center of Jewish life. After the Revolution, the Jews of Newport petitioned George Washington to support their rights as citizens in 1790 when the first president visited their city. It was sort of like, you know, the father of the country is in town. We should probably introduce ourselves and make a request. Washington visited the synagogue, which, by the way, the building is the longest continuously used synagogue building in the United States. A man named Moses Sykes was the synagogue's warden as of 1790. He composed a petition to Washington, and he began by noting that the Jews of Newport had heretofore been deprived of the invaluable rights of free citizens. You know, they hadn't been allowed to be citizens in Rhode Island. Sykes and the others, they knew the history that I just told you. They knew that no matter how successful Jews in Newport were, they weren't accepted as citizens. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. And Sykes continued, "We now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generally affords to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenships." It was sort of an aspirational statement. Like, this is what we would like our new government to be like. And it hasn't always been that way. Could you help assure us that things will change in the future? Washington wrote, or really dictated, a letter in return. And he was very encouraging. said, all possess a like liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were an indulgence. You know, Washington suggested we shouldn't just have toleration in which a group like Jews are grudgingly allowed to reside in our midst. And he said then, in response to Sykes's request, happily, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, and requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, which the Lopez family and many others had done for decades. We'll come back to those words of Washington at the end today. So you might recall, I mentioned that Aaron Lopez's ships had brought hundreds, maybe more than 1,000, enslaved individuals from Africa to the Western Hemisphere. We don't know much about the individuals who were on those ships. It's a good bet that some of those men, women, and children were Muslim. And what I'm going to do next is tell the story of one enslaved Muslim man. And just to be clear, Omar ibn Said was not brought on one of Aaron Lopez's ships. That would have been really good for today's lecture. Would have tied everything together. But his story is a good generation later. Said was captured in the year 1807 in Fouta Toro, which is in present-day Senegal. Would have been somewhere between the Senegal River and the Gambia River. So this is about a generation after Aaron Lopez died. North Africa had been predominantly Muslim for many centuries. The kingdom of Fouta had been Islamized in the 11th century. There were a lot of centers of Islamic learning in the western part of North Africa. Timbuktu is one famous example. But we know that Omar ibn Said was a learned man who had received a long and extensive Islamic education. This is how he described it. I sought knowledge under the instruction of a sheikh called Muhammad Said, my own brother, and then two other individuals. I continued my studies 25 years. So, you know, you can plan to stay at George Mason University, I don't know, until about 2045, if you want that much education. This was actually pretty typical for learned Muslims in West Africa to sort of travel to several specific locations to seek instruction from specific individuals. Often that involved long study and reflection on the Quran. There's a historian who wrote a great book on Muslim education in West Africa with the title The Walking Quran. The goal in many of these societies was for individuals to so well absorb the principles and teachings of the Quran that they would embody it in their lives to the point where they would become walking Qurans themselves. Said was learned. He was also pious and observant. This is how he described his practice. My religion was the religion of Muhammad, the apostle of God. I walked to the mosque before daybreak, washed my face and head and hands and feet, I prayed at noon, prayed in the afternoon, prayed at sunset, prayed in the evening. He gave alms. He participated in military struggles against non-Muslim peoples in West Africa. He also made pilgrimage to Mecca, as all did who were able. We also know from that description that this was a pretty wealthy guy. He had sufficient resources to undertake a pilgrimage that would have been more than 1,000 miles at great expense. He also clearly had significant alms to give every year, including gold and silver. So he was wealthy, he was learned, and he was pious. By the early 19th century, wars among the various kingdoms and peoples of West Africa were very common. There had been, for quite some time, wars between Muslim and non-Muslim kingdoms in West Africa. Everything became far less stable with the arrival of Europeans who were seeking captives to purchase and export across the ocean. And we don't really know the particular circumstances or conflict that led to Said's capture. He described it pretty briefly. There came to our place a large army who killed many men and took me and brought me to the great sea and sold me into the hands of the Christians, who bound me and sent me on board a great ship, and we sailed upon the great sea a month and a half when we came to a place called Charleston. So all of a sudden, his life just takes this tragic turn. Once he reached Charleston, Said was purchased by a man named Johnson, whom Said described as a complete infidel, a cruel man. Said described himself as a fairly small and weak individual, and he suffered greatly at the hands of Johnson. We again don't know the details, but it must have been a terrifying new existence. After a month, he ran away. He escaped. He went north. He ended up in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He noticed that there were churches, which he apparently recognized as such, in the town. On the new moon, I went into a church to pray, he later wrote. A boy spotted him and told his father that he had seen a black man in the church. Men came with a troop of dogs and put him in jail. Other men came and talked with him. He couldn't speak English terribly well at this point. Apparently, while he was in jail, he wrote in Arabic on the walls of the jail. And that attracted some curiosity. And he eventually ended up in the household of a man named Jim Owen. Said remained enslaved to the Owen family for many decades until his death in 1864. That's a picture of Omar ibn Said not very long before his death. We don't know a great deal about his day-to-day existence during those many decades. But we do know a few things about his religious trajectory because he wrote about them at somewhat great length. In 1821, Said formally converted to Christianity and joined a Presbyterian church through baptism.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Why did he do that? We don't really know the circumstances. Had he been convinced of the truth of Christianity? Did he convert because the Owen family recommended it? We just don't know. One of Said's ministers commented that by all outward signs, Said was a faithful Christian. I think that's such an interesting phrase, by all outward signs. In a sense, Said became a Muslim converso. Like the Lopez family, he outwardly converted to Christianity, but he inwardly remained a Muslim. How do we know this, or why might we think that is the case? Said wrote an account of his life in Arabic in 1831, 10 years after his conversion to Christianity. He began his autobiography by writing verbatim the 67th surah of the Quran, which begins, at least in the way Said wrote it, "In the name of God, the merciful, the gracious, God grant his blessing upon our Prophet Muhammad. Blessed be he in whose hands is the kingdom and who is almighty." Also including this passage, "Those who disbelieve in their Lord will suffer the punishment of hell. What an evil destination. When they are tossed into it, they will hear its roaring as it boils over." This is a rather striking way to begin an autobiography if you're a convert to Christianity. And clearly, Said, he had a really good memory. There's a strong affirmation here that God is sovereign, even in the midst of slavery and hardship. And I like to think that when he wrote about those who disbelieve in God ending up in hell, I have to think that Said must have at least had in his mind those individuals who had contributed to his capture and enslavement. Said's religion, both his identity as a Muslim and his conversion to Christianity, worked in his favor. He was something of a curiosity and a celebrity. His owner actually later purchased him an English translation of the Quran. And Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, bought him an Arabic language Bible. So because he was unusual, people took an interest in him, which probably made his decades of enslavement more tolerable. Here are some excerpts from his autobiography about his conversion. "They permit me to read the gospel of God, our Lord and Savior and King, who regulates all circumstances. According to power, I open my heart as to a great light to receive the true way, the way of the Master Jesus, the Messiah." Formerly, he says, he used to read the Quran, but Jim Owen and his wife used to read the gospel, and they read it to him, the gospel of our God, our Lord, our Creator, our King, the God that orders all our circumstances. Thanks to the Lord of all worlds, thanks in abundance. He is plenteous in mercy and abundant in goodness. When I was a Mohammedan, a Muslim, I prayed thus, but now I pray, Our Father, in the words of our Master Jesus, the Messiah. It's such a really fascinating passage, and I think it's probably very carefully thought out and constructed. And one thing that strikes me, and it might strike you if you remember the passages from the Quran about Jesus that we read earlier in the semester, is that Said doesn't make any affirmations about Jesus that a Muslim could not make. He refers to Jesus as the Messiah. So does the Quran. The Quran also refers positively to the gospel. I think as far as Said was concerned, a Muslim could pray the Lord's Prayer. It calls on God for mercy, forgiveness, and assistance. And if you read translations of Said's autobiography, you'll often see, instead of Master, Lord Jesus, which a Muslim would not affirm with the customary word that might be used for God. But the Arabic word used in his autobiography can simply be translated as master, a lesser appellation that a prophet might receive. So I don't know for sure. We can't go back in time and peer into Said's heart. Yes, question, Zachary, and wondering if you wouldn't mind using the mic for it.
In my opinion, what you're doing right here is a little dishonest, because I feel like you're saying, you can't really sure it's legitimate or whatnot, but then at the same time you're heavily implying that he only converted to save face, which would be understandable, seeing as a lot of converso Jews and converso Muslims did the same thing in order to, integrate easier into Christian societies. But I feel like, here's the thing though, we're not God and we don't know people's hearts. It maybe was legitimate or maybe not, I don't know.
No, thanks for the comment. Well, I'll just say I don't think I'm doing it dishonestly. I do think he was just legitimately very careful. Yep.
You okay? You all right?
Are you okay, Eric?
Yeah, fine.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I'm saying two things at the same time. We can't know for sure what was going on in his heart. He could have had a genuine religious experience that caused him to embrace Christianity. I think also there are other possibilities. He could have genuinely appreciated the Christian religiosity of the Owen family and, felt some desire to both honor that and advance his own interests. The reason why I think it is reasonable to conclude that he remained a Muslim is the care with which he describes this. He describes a Jesus that a Muslim could embrace and refers to a gospel that a Muslim man could honor. So, that's my best sense of his experience. So, like I said, I think Said was what you could say a crypto-Muslim, a Muslim converso in the United States. I think there's no way he didn't know exactly what the Quran taught about Jesus. He was very well educated. He'd studied with a number of teachers. He had made pilgrimage. He had memorized significant portions of the Quran. So I think he was still a Muslim. And it was, by the way, this public conversion to Christianity was good for him. There were individuals across the country, Christian ministers and abolitionists, who took an interest in him, who purchased books for him. And actually, there were some individuals who offered to help finance his return to Africa. I think they were hoping that he would go there as a Christian missionary. He declined the offer. By then, he had been in the United States for quite some time. He presumed that his family in West Africa was dead. And he remained here until his death in 1864. Had he lived one more year, he would have been emancipated from slavery. Said did not marry in the United States, so he didn't pass down his beliefs and practices to any children. So his story is not like that of the Lopez family, in which a family secretly preserved its religious identity for many generations. And in fact, although scholars debate the point, it seems that Muslim practice and belief did not survive beyond the 19th century in the United States. Slavery in the Americas was brutal. Most elements of African culture, Muslim or otherwise, didn't persist. Then in the late 1800s, new Muslim immigrants from places like Syria and Lebanon brought Islam to the United States again. And some African Americans also developed what you might call American forms of Islam. So those are two stories, and I've got one more. And this is from the 19th century. And it's not an extended story about an individual, but some insight into the fact that well into the 20th century, some Americans felt it prudent or necessary to obscure their religious identities. So we're gonna jump ahead a bit. By the 1930s, there were perhaps 4.5 million Jews in the United States. That was as opposed to around 2,000 at the time of the American Revolution. This chart isn't quite precise because it makes it look like it's zero, but it was such a small number at the time of Aaron Lopez. Hundreds of thousands of Jews emigrated from Eastern and Central Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was part of an enormous wave of immigration from places like Poland, Italy, and Russia. Many old stock Americans, English, German, and even people of Irish ancestry, were upset and alarmed at the new arrivals. And they were especially alarmed at the influx of Jews. It's pretty easy to come to the United States until the 1920s. And during this long wave of high rates of immigration, a lot of Americans objected to what they understood as an open door policy. This is a political cartoon from 1890. It depicts a identifiably Jewish immigrant. And that might not be readily apparent to you, but it's an individual that appears like a Jewish peddler with a prayer shawl, labeled with things like Sabbath desecration, poverty, and disease. And he's wanting to enter the United States. Uncle Sam is there holding his nose because this individual is undesirable and smelly, right? And the emigrant says, "Can I come in?" And Uncle Sam says, "I suppose you can. There's no law to keep you out." Zachary.
I gotta say, that caricature doesn't sound like a very good Jew because he has a barrel on his back labeled Sabbath desecration.
Well, correct. I mean, it's meant to depict a Jew in the most unfavorable light possible.
We honestly need to bring those cartoons back. Some of them are funny as hell.
Well, I mean, offensive as hell as well. By the 1920s, the door was no longer so open. Congress passed a series of highly restricted immigration acts that pretty much slammed the door on immigration from places like Poland or Russia. Anti-Semitism, a desire to keep Jews out, that wasn't the only reason for these new laws, but it was a big factor. Many Americans associated Jews, especially Russian Jews, with Bolshevism and other forms of radicalism. Many Americans also believed that Jews had formed a worldwide conspiracy that controlled banks and sought to overthrow governments. Those ideas didn't have any basis in reality. If anyone was going to form a conspiracy to take over the world, it wasn't going to be the Jews. It was going to be groups like the Nazis, who obviously hated Jews. So did Joseph Stalin, the later Soviet dictator. But Americans thought that Jews were a religious, economic, and political danger. And other Americans didn't change their minds about Jewish immigration after the rise of Adolf Hitler and the persecution of Jews in Germany that became the Holocaust. And American anti-Semitism affected Jews on very personal levels. Many resorts, hotels, and country clubs were closed to Jews, similar to the ways that many businesses were closed to African Americans. This is from after World War II. It's a beach club on the Chesapeake in Anne Arundel County in Maryland. There was a landowner who operated a private beach, and one had to pay a nominal membership fee in order to become a member who could utilize this beach. And it made it very clear that Jews, along with dogs, were not welcome. Membership limited to Gentiles only. And members and guests were limited to Gentiles, so non-Jews, Christians really, of North European ancestry. Second example, from a swimming club in Baltimore. Privileges of the swimming pool are extended only to approved Gentiles. So, keeping out persons of African descent, Jews, any other individuals who were, who were not desirable. And employment was also often discriminatory, as you can imagine. Many employers made it clear they didn't want to hire Jewish applicants. So if you were looking for a job and your last name was Rosenberg or Goldstein, they weren't going to hire you. Many Jews responded to workplace discrimination by finding a less bigoted employer, or maybe finding a Jewish employer. But also, some chose to change their last names and take other measures to obscure their identities. A historian named Kirsten Fermaglish investigated this phenomena. She went to an archive in New York City and looked at just big stacks of petitions that individuals filed with the city government to change their names, change their last names typically. And just as an aside, that just kind of speaks to the, in my opinion, the creativity of some academic historians. There's sort of an old idea that immigrants had their names changed on Ellis Island, which sometimes happen. But Fermaglish found some individuals, under pressure, they chose to change their names. And she found that a very disproportionate number of those petitions were from Jewish New Yorkers. For instance, a job applicant might change his name from Rosenberg to Robinson, or from Goldstein to Goodman. And some Jews reported that as soon as they changed their last name, or at least put something else down on an application form, they were able to get a job. She tells the story of a woman named Dora Sarietsky, who in the 1930s, in her petition to change her name, she describes that she's been to a number of employers and she's unable to get a job. And then she later comments that after she changed her last name to Watson, she immediately landed a job. And other Jews found other ways to mask their Jewishness. Some women would wear a cross necklace to a job interview so as to outwardly appear Christian. Others would lie about where they were born or in which neighborhood their parents lived. And by the way, back in the 1930s, 1940s, in most parts of the country, employers more or less openly discriminated without any legal repercussions. You can find help wanted ads that would just very straightforwardly say, no Jews or no Hebrews wanted, or Gentiles only. It took the civil rights movement to establish clear principles against discrimination in the workforce. So here, once again, are conversos in America. Okay, without the threat of the Spanish Inquisition. But here's Dora Sarietsky, a Jewish woman, posing, really, as Dora Watson, ostensibly a Christian. At least at work, she was a crypto Jew. And there were hundreds of other individuals like her. And I think this is still not uncommon, super uncommon in the United States of today. You can glance at statistics about religiously motivated hate crimes, which against both Muslims and Jews are up significantly in recent decades. The statistics on instances of anti-Semitism in particular are up really exponentially over the last several years. And that certainly leads individuals to, at times, want to keep their religious identities private and secret. It's sometimes prudent to do so. You can find oral histories of American Muslims who decided to stop wearing hijab after 9/11 or to shave their beards. You can find many individuals who decide to persist with their public religious identities despite that threat, but others feel compelled to make their religious identities more private. After the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attacks on Israel, the resulting Israeli war on Gaza, and the surge of anti-Israel protests at American universities, many Jewish students have asked themselves whether it's safe to be openly Jewish. Should they wear a Star of David necklace, or leave it at home, or drop it under their shirts? Many Americans see Islam as a dangerous foreign import. Some Americans still see Judaism that way as well. Don't misunderstand me. The United States still enjoys a high degree of religious freedom, and in some places it's easy for religious minorities to be open about who they are, what they believe, and what they practice. But there are also many settings, I think too many settings, including on college campuses, where people, students, faculty maybe, feel the need to be quiet about who they are. And that's not limited to Muslims and Jews. It's not necessarily easy in many college classrooms to be openly Catholic or evangelical either, or maybe atheist in some places. I think it's important to remember the experiences of Jews like the Lopezes and Muslims like Omar ibn Said. The Lopezes had to pretend to be Christians in Portugal. They came to the American colonies because they could be openly Jewish, even though it wasn't clear they could become citizens. Omar ibn Said's experience was maybe the inverse. He felt that he had to pretend to embrace Christianity while a slave in North Carolina. I think history informs us that if the United States is going to fulfill George Washington's vision of a place that grants no sanction to bigotry, we have to work to create places in which individuals have the full freedom to reveal and live out their religious identities, so that everyone can sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. We're not there yet, but I think a college classroom is a good place to start. Another question.
I just wanted to say, forgive me for saying this,
Yeah.
but that spike in there, like between 2020 and 2023, I don't know, it looks a little fake. I'm sorry, that's just what it looks like. I don't doubt that it's real, but like it feels almost like, I don't know, how could it get that high in such a short span of time? Is it like the war in Gaza or something, or what?
So the question is, can you trust the Anti-Defamation League statistics on anti-Jewish hate crimes? So I will just say, if you look, this is a chart that goes back to 1979. And for, the 2 decades from basically 1995 to around 2015, there's, a clear decline. So I'll just point to a couple of things. 2017 was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where neo-Nazis and white supremacists protested the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue, but also chanted things like, "Jews will not replace us." I think, in recent years, there's been a surge of anti-Semitism online. A lot of ugly ideas spread more easily than had been the case in recent decades. There's also the Tree of Life shootings in Pittsburgh, which I think it's, I don't know, I forget the year, 2017, 2019. There was a demonstrable rise in anti-Semitism even before the October 7th attacks and the Israeli war in Gaza. There's been more over the last year and a half. And yes, I do trust the Anti-Defamation League statistics. Alessandro.
Question about what you were just talking about. Do you think that the rises in these sorts of things statistically are due to a general rise in the sentiments of anti-Semitism, or is it more that it's just that it's more radical? So do you think there are more people who hold these beliefs, or the people that do acting in ways that are more easily quantifiable on a statistical level?
Both of which, both I believe. So the ADL works with a group of researchers that conducts a social scientific survey of Americans about anti-Semitic beliefs. And it's basically conducted the same survey since 1964. It asks people things like, do you think Jews control the media? Various anti-Semitic ideas about Jews. Those beliefs were trending down for most of the last half century until about 10 or 15 years ago. And there's been a steady increase. I think there's a number of reasons for the surge of anti-Semitism in recent years. I do think the ability of ugly ideas to spread quickly on social media, I think that's one factor that is different. I do think a surge of anti-Israel activism since the early 2000s, I also think that's a contributing factor. I think there's also like tension in places like New York between Orthodox Jewish communities in particular and other groups of immigrants. So it's, there's a number of things that are happening at the same time. The reality, I think, is pretty ugly.
Thank you.
All right. See you all on Thursday.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Book Notes Plus podcast, you can find all the episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Lectures in History will be back next week.